the bombshell story of the weekend, which I'm just amazed. I watched the news this morning. I watched, I don't know, probably 30, 40 minutes of Scarborough's show and caught MSNBC for a while. Listened to NPR while I was taking a shower and all that normal stuff, and didn't hear a single mention of this. Now, maybe it happened and I just didn't catch it, but over the weekend in the New York Times, it was reported that this guy who his name is Ben Barnes. He was the former Speaker of the House in Texas, and the Lieutenant Governor of that state. No shrinking violet, and this big deal guy. He and John Connally traveled around the Middle East right in the middle of 1980. On behalf of Ronald Reagan, to convince the Ayatollahs to hang on to the Ayatollah Khomeini, to hang on to the hostages. I mean, this was in the New York Times on Saturday. And, I've been telling you about this for years. I mean, Bonnie Sauter, President Bonnie Sauter, who was president of Iran at the time that this happened, came to the United States. He just died last year here in the United States. He came to the United States and got a gig as a visiting professor at Northeastern College, one of the colleges up in the Northeast. And he gave an interview to the Christian Science Monitor, in which he just, he laid it right out. He said, after arriving in France in 1981, I told a BBC reporter that I left Iran to expose the symbiotic relationship between Khomeinism and Reaganism. Ayatollah Khomeini and Ronald Reagan had organized a clandestine negotiation, later known as the October Surprise, which prevented the attempts by myself and then U.S. President Jimmy Carter to free the hostages before the 1980 U.S. presidential election took place. The fact that they were not released tipped the election in favor of Reagan, end quote. That's what the president of Iran said. I mean, this has not been a secret. That was in 2013. But here we are 10 years later. The New York Times absolutely corroborates this with the actual guy who was conveying the message, or who was accompanying John Connally, who was conveying the message. I encourage you to read the piece in the New York Times, or you can read, there's links to it and excerpts from it at hartmannreport.com. But here's the deal. So now we know for sure that Iran-Contra, which, by the way, Bill Barr, when he was George Herbert Walker Bush's Attorney General, head of the Department of Justice, Bill Barr advised George Herbert Walker Bush when Bush was about to be indicted for this, because Lawrence Walsh was going after Bush too. He was about to leave office. This was 3 weeks before Bill Clinton was sworn in as president. He pardoned all 6 of the people who were involved with Iran-Contra that we knew about, including Caspar Weinberger and Ollie North, and that just ended the investigation. That was the full stop beginning of a cover-up that lasted right up until day before yesterday, of Reagan and Bush's involvement with Iran in screwing Jimmy Carter. Can you imagine how different the world would have been if Jimmy Carter had been president in 1980 instead of Ronald Reagan? But hey, we got Ronald Reagan. So anyhow, that's kind of at the top of the news because that was a story in the Washington Post over the weekend. But hey, that is just one of the Republican presidents who have come into office by committing treason. And I use that word very carefully. Longtime listeners know that listeners to this program know that I am not, prone to hyperbole when it comes to using words like treason. But conspiring with a foreign government to hold Americans hostage for an additional year, they were hostages for 444 days, to hold American hostages hostage is, in my opinion, treason. And that's exactly what Ronald Reagan did to get himself elected in 1980. But this didn't start with Reagan. This started in 1968. In 1968, Lyndon Johnson was president. Hubert Humphrey was vice president. Richard Nixon had tried to become president in 1960 and had lost against John Kennedy. And now he had reinvented himself as the anti-war candidate. He was going to solve the Vietnam War with his secret plan. Meanwhile, throughout 68, actually started in the fall of 67, Lyndon Johnson and Hubert Humphrey had been negotiating with both the North and South Vietnamese to end the war in Vietnam. And they had finally reached an agreement. And the war was going to end in October of 1968, which would have saved 1 million Vietnamese lives and 22,000 American lives. That's the number of people who died after Nixon became president with his secret plan to end the war, which he never ended. Jerry Ford ended the war. And in the midst of this, Nixon has his people, Anna Chennault, he has his people reaching out to North and South Vietnam, particularly South Vietnam, and saying, hey, if you'll just hold off until after the election and don't do this peace deal that you've negotiated with LBJ, I'll make you rich. I'll give you a better deal. And Lyndon Johnson, a week before the election, has finally reached the point where, it's obvious Nixon's going to win because he and Humphrey couldn't end the war because Nixon had sabotaged the peace effort. And he calls up Everett Dirksen, the leader, the most powerful and influential Republican in Washington, D.C. at the time, the leader of the Republicans in the United States Senate, the elder statesman of the United States Senate, Everett Dirksen, and says, we've been wiretapping these South Vietnamese, and the FBI has it. This is treason. Well, here's the clip, actually. This is coming out of my computer here, Sean. This is Lyndon Johnson, President Lyndon Johnson, talking to Everett Dirksen.
Here's the latest information we got. The agent says that they just talked to the boss in New Mexico. And that he says that you must hold out. Just hold on until after the election. We know what Chew is saying to them out there. Yeah. We're pretty well informed on both ends. Now, I'm reading their hand, Everett. I don't want to get this in the campaign. That's right. And they oughtn't to be doing this. This is treason. I know.
I know. So that's the senior statesman, the Republican statesman, Everett Dirksen, saying, yes, I know it's treason. And he tried to stop Nixon. In fact, there's another recording of LBJ 2 days later with Richard Nixon in which Nixon denies that he's doing it. And LBJ just says, come on, I'm not buying this BS. You're going to inherit this war. You shouldn't be doing this. You're going to have thousands of Americans dying on your watch because of what you did to win this election. And Nixon just blows him off. We've gone through the treason of Ronald Reagan, which was, double, tripled down on this weekend by the New York Times and is being largely ignored by our media. I think it's the biggest story of the year, but what the heck. And we talked about the treason of Richard Nixon, which started this. I mean, Reagan knew that he could get away with this because Nixon got pardoned by Jerry Ford, right? When one Republican president commits treason to become president, other, future Republican presidents are going to look at that and go, hey, why not? So that takes us up to George W. Bush. George W. Bush is, running for president in 2000, and the election comes down to one state, the state that his brother is running, the state of Florida. And in Florida, George W. Bush, his brother, Jeb Bush, has his Secretary of State, Katherine Harris, purge at least 57,000 African Americans off the voting rolls just a month before the election. That George Bush, quote, wins by 537 votes in the official count. Well, the state Supreme Court, the Florida Supreme Court, orders a recount. And all across the state, they're starting to recount the votes. And it's starting to look like that recount might indicate that Al Gore actually won more votes. And so Roger Stone and his buddies go down there with this program called Stop the Steal and start pounding on the windows of the place in Miami where they're counting the vote. Right-wing radio hosts all across the country get into it, say it's Gore Loser Man, making fun of Joe Lieberman's last name. And finally, George W. Bush sues at the Supreme Court. And Anthony Scalia, in his, concurring opinion, it was Rehnquist who wrote the opinion, 5 Republicans on the Supreme Court stopped the recount. They overruled, in violation of the 9th Amendment, or the 10th Amendment, States' Rights Amendment, 10th Amendment. They overruled the Florida Supreme Court, which has never been done before, at least not in this way. And the United States Supreme Court said, no, we're just going to let George W. Bush get installed as president. Because Scalia wrote, and I quote, "The counting of votes does, in my view, threaten irreparable harm to George W. Bush and to the country by casting a cloud upon what Bush claims to be the legitimacy of his election." This was their rationale. So Bush gets installed by a bunch of corrupt cronies on the U.S. Supreme Court, and then to get himself reelected in 2004, well, he told his biographer, Mickey Herskowitz, the guy that his parents hired to write his autobiography, A Charge to Keep, in 1999. In 1999, he tells his biographer, and this is coming out of the 360, Sean, told him exactly what he was going to do if he got elected in 2000.
As a matter of fact, in interviews in 1999 with respected journalists and longtime Bush family friend Mickey Herskowitz,
this is Cindy Sheehan,
then Governor George Bush stated, "One of the keys to being seen as a great leader is to be seen as commander-in-chief. My father had all this political capital built up when he drove the Iraqis out of Kuwait, and he wasted it. If I have a chance to invade, if I had that much capital, I'm not going to waste it. I'm going to get everything passed that I want to get passed, and I'm going to have a successful presidency," end quote.
So then Bush and Cheney, whose Halliburton company was failing at that time, he desperately needed some military contracts, lied us into the war in Iraq. So that's treason number 3. And then now, of course, we've got Trump. His first week in office, he handed an Israeli spy off to the Russian. The Russian ambassador was in his office. Here's this guy's name. And committed, I mean, you know all the other treasons that Trump committed. So that's 4 treasonous Republican presidents. 4 of them.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
It's time to finally put one of them in prison. Hopefully this is going to work.